The first person to translate the work was William Wotton, a linguistic child prodigy and later a dissolute clergyman, another name in the Cranston Library network, both as author and donor. Cranston's collecting energy waned towards the end of his life, but he was determined to ensure the survival of the library. He set up a trust in 1708, shortly before his death, with 44 trustees. The list contains, as well as Lord Somers, several future, current and past MPs for Reigate, including Lord Somers' nominee who replaced Stephen Harvey on his death in 1707, James Cox Esquire. Also on the list were Sir John Parsons, Sir John Jekyll, and a friendly elector in one of Somers' burgage freeholds, the printer and publisher Jacob Tonson. But the majority of the trustees were Reigate townsfolk. In 1710, there was a rupture of the electoral pact. The general election was held in the wake of the impeachment of Dr. Henry Sacheverell after an incendiary gunpowder plot day sermon accusing the Whigs of undermining the Anglican Church by embracing religious toleration. It brought the Tories back into power on a wave of populist unrest. Sacheverell became a popular hero, a Tory martyr, and the focus for whipped-up anti-Whig sympathies. James Cox lost his seat as Sir John Parsons broke his agreement and swept back in with John Ward as running mate, a carpet-bagging London merchant who hedged his bets by standing both in Reigate and Weymouth. To his chagrin, he won in Reigate but lost in Weymouth. He petitioned there and failed, then spent much of his Reigate tenure pursuing his Weymouth interests. He was a substantial naval contractor. Ward's career was literally rags to riches, floorcloths to government contracts and shareholding in the United East India and South Seas companies. One commentator ascribed his success to the devil, who procured him an estate of 6,000 a year and made him a member of Parliament to cover the cheat. He did not last long in the Reigate seat. The Sacheverell phenomenon burnt itself out, and Parsons' financial position encouraged him to renew the pact with Somers. So in 1713, Ward was replaced by James Cox, and the natural order of things was restored. Ward finally made it to Weymouth as MP in 1722, but did not last long there either, being expelled from the Commons for forgery. Many attempts were made to get him to answer charges of forgery and fraud. And without the protection of a parliamentary seat, he finally ran out of road in 1732 and surrendered to commissioners for bankruptcy, suspected of embezzling £50,000 in their money of South Sea funds. Nevertheless, he was briefly MP for Reigate, and he's left his mark on the library, albeit after losing his seat, with a donation of 3 volumes of George Bull's Some Important Points of Primitive Christianity of 1714, and in 1717, Bull's Opera Omnia and Robert Nelson's Life of Dr. George Bull. Quite the fan of Dr. Bull. Even fraudsters can have a taste for Trinitarian theology, it seems. James Cox, first elected in 1707, was Somers' nephew, the son of his sister Mary, and her husband Charles Cox Esquire, another Worcester lawyer. After Sir John Parsons died in 1717, he was replaced by William Jordan of Gatwick, and on William Jordan's death by his brother Thomas Jordan, who they were both substantial donors in Cranston's time. At length, the 2 sisters and joint heirs of Lord Somers, who had died intestate in 1716, established their claim to his estate, bought out the interests of the Parsons family, and so Tory influence in the borough came to an end. At the next election in 1722, Sir Joseph Jekyll came in with James Cox in the last contested election in Reigate before the Great Reform Act in 1832. That is quite something. On Jekyll's death in 1738, John Harvey, son of Stephen, was elected as a stopgap. Then in 1741, Philip York Jr. was elected, the first of 3 sons of the Earl of Hardwicke to hold the seat for the next 43 years. James Cox's sister Margaret had married Philip York Sr., whose life story is similar to Lord Somers's. The able son of a provincial lawyer, called to the bar, acted in Parliament, destined to be Lord Chancellor, created Baron in 1733, then first Earl of Hardwicke in 1754. He too husbanded a collection of family seats, including the county seat for Cambridgeshire, as well as Reigate. These 2 families, Cox and York, who later intermarried again, went on to dominate the political life of Reigate almost to the end of its existence as a constituency. After 1722, Reigate's parliamentary history entered a new and calmer phase, a century and more of carefully managed, uncontested elections, where the nominees of the 2 patrons presented themselves to the electors of Reigate and were returned unopposed. Part of that careful management was to take the trouble to go through the motions, and at one point the Earl of Hardwicke complained bitterly of the expense of an election, as even though the result was never in doubt, part of the deal was that the electors expected to be generously treated. But this care and nurturing of the vote proved to be a good investment when demands for reform came to be heard. The Cox and York family seats were, with a few disruptions, destined for family members. I put this slide up because it shows the old House of Commons. It's a little bit later than the period I'm directly speaking about at the moment. We'll get there in the end. Eldest sons sat until raised to the peerage, then younger sons, then nephews, half-brothers and cousins, when the supply of sons of qualifying age ran out. The roster of members and the number of years they served speak to this stability. James Cox sat from 1707 to 1747, bar the Sacheverell years. His son died young, and Charles Cox, his nephew, sat from 1747 to 1784. Philip York, Hardwicke's heir, sat from 1741 until 1747, when he was summoned to the other family seat of Cambridgeshire, until he succeeded his father in 1764. From 1747, his brother Charles sat until 1768, followed by his brother John until 1784. None of these Reigate members had brilliant careers, but they were conscientious parliamentarians, gradually shifting over the century away from their Whig origins towards the Conservative interest. None of them rivaled Lord Somers or Lord Hardwicke in ambition or achievement. In 1784, there was a break in this pattern, when Sir Charles Cox, by then, was raised to the peerage, the Somers barony being revived for him, and the Honourable John York retired. The patrons' nominees that year were Edward Leeds, a Cambridgeshire man, for Hardwicke, and William Bellingham for Cox, now Somers. Bellingham was secretary to Prime Minister Pitt, by whose good offices Cox had been made a peer. One good turn deserves another. And spent his brief parliamentary career in Reigate, making himself useful to the government. Leeds was much more inclined to go off-piste, voting randomly with and against the government line, to the disgust of his patron. And in 1787, he was induced to vacate his seat, being replaced briefly by Reginald Pole Carew, who was connected by marriage to both the Coxes and the Yorks. In 1789, Bellingham made himself useful again by vacating the Reigate seat to be taken by Samuel Lord Hood. Hood was a naval hero of the 7 Years' War and the American Revolutionary War, soon to return to service commanding the Mediterranean fleet during the Napoleonic Wars. But during the relatively peaceful 1780s, he entered Parliament. Being an Irish peer, he was entitled to stand for election. He fought the City of Westminster seat in 1784 in a bitter contest as one of 2 government-supported candidates trying to defeat Charles James Fox. But though Hood won a seat, so did Fox, and Hood's ally lost out. In 1789, Hood had the humiliation of losing his seat to an ally of Fox. So he was parachuted into Reigate, courtesy of the Somers Cox family. It is worth mentioning that we are considering a period of neglect and decay in the life of Reigate Public Library. The energy of Cranston's foundation and foresight gradually dissipated after his death in 1708, until the beginnings of a revival in the 1780s. By the 1740s, nearly all the original trustees had died and not been replaced. James Cox, MP, was one of only two surviving in 1744. The long incumbency of the Reverend William Stead began in 1741 and lasted until his death in 1781. In 1744, he undertook a survey of the charities in his parish, including the library, and noted the poor state of the library and the lack of trustees. However, this did not prompt him to revive the library or the trust. And for about 20 years, from the mid-1750s to the mid-1770s, only a handful of loans were recorded in the register. And you can see how messily too. The library was at its lowest ebb. Nevertheless, this period marked the re-establishment of the tradition of an incoming MP making a formal presentation to the public library. And later, an arms race developed in presenting the most worthy, substantial, and luxurious item. So let us have a look at the treasures that came into the library at that time. Oh, sorry, I keep pressing the wrong key. Right, there we are. First of all, on the same day, the 3rd of May, 1741, the incoming member, Philip York, and the long-standing member, James Cox, both made significant gifts. York's gift was Conyers Middleton's History of the Life of Marcus Tullius Cicero. Cox gave the 2-volume set of Ephraim Chambers' Cyclopedia, or an Universal Dictionary of Arts and Sciences. When compared to the dearth of donations in the preceding 20 years, both were magnificent additions to the collection. Chambers' Cyclopedia, in particular, was an inspiring work, possibly the earliest attempt at creating a universal and systematic survey of knowledge in English. It was first published in 1728 and later revised and expanded several times. Its influence was widespread. It was translated into Italian and French and thought to be a direct inspiration for Diderot's landmark work, L'Encyclopédie. Conyers Middleton was a clergyman, is a rather difficult person, prolific author and holder of university posts in Cambridge. But his controversial religious views denied him preferment. His excursion into the classics with his Life of Marcus Tullius Cicero, compiled in his own words from his own works, brought him financial success, although he was plausibly accused of plagiarism of an early 17th century work. This version is a luxurious production published by subscription, and York was a subscriber. You can see that his misprinted name in the list has caused the scribe a problem, one of several. After taking up his seat in 1747, Charles Cox began the progressive donation of Nathaniel Hooke's 4-volume Roman history, completing the gift in 1766. Philip York stood down in 1747. And Charles York took his seat. I'm sorry, I do think these two families should actually have been given a book of babies' names for boys, because they're very difficult to tease out the generations. They both donated books to the library that year. Philip York presenting Edmund Chisel, Travels in Turkey and Back to England, travel books being immensely popular in the library. Charles York donated a 4-volume set of Francis Bacon's works. John York, brother of the above, took up his seat in 1768, and in 1769 gave the library the 4-volume set of Sir William Blackstone, Commentary on the Laws of England. This takes us up to 1784 and the temporary disappearance of the Coxes and the Yorks. In came Edward Leeds and William Bellingham, and outdoing any of the previous gifts, they presented the library with the utterly magnificent 6-volume set of Francis Hargrave's complete collection of state trials. State trials embraced treason, murder by those entitled to be tried in the House of Peers, but also heresy, witchcraft, and divorce. Highlights of these huge volumes might be the reports of the trials of Anne Boleyn and Charles I, Guy Fawkes and the Gunpowder Plotters, but eye-opening stories are to be found in any of the murder, witchcraft, or divorce trials too. In case there is any doubt that this was a scrupulously honoured convention, the stopgap MP who replaced Edward Leeds in 1787, Reginald Pole Carew, gave the library a beautiful copy of Thomas Tanner's Notitia Monastica, or an account of all the abbeys. This is even more richly bound than the volumes of state trials. In 1789, Samuel Lord Hood upped the ante. Did he think he now had a seat for life, or was he just very grateful for being rescued? Hood's munificent gift was a complete set of the peerages of England and Wales, Ireland and Scotland, which takes up most of a shelf in the library. The Reverend Geoffrey Snelson, vicar at the time, wrote an admiring inscription in the first volume of the set, extolling Hood's success in maritime affairs. In 1790, after less than a year, Hood had the opportunity to stand for his former Westminster seat and won. So it is possible that the only lasting mark he made on Reigate is this gift to the Cranston Library. After this short period, which must have been so confusing for the inhabitants of Reigate as they struggled to remember the names of their MPs, normal service was resumed. At the general election of 1790, the Cox family put up the Honourable John Somers Cox, heir to the recently created Baron Somers, who held the seat until succeeding his father in 1806. The Hardwicks put up Joseph Sidney York, half-brother to the third Earl, just 21 years old. York had an already successful naval career. Look at that dashing captain there. The intention was that he should nurse the Reigate seat for his nephew Philip York, Viscount Royston, Hardwicke's heir, just 8 years old. During his first spell at Reigate, owing to the Napoleonic Wars, his naval career took precedence, and he spent little time in Parliament. In 1806, he relinquished the seat to Viscount Royston, who was travelling in Europe, and elected in absentia. Royston died at sea in 1808 without having set foot in Reigate as its MP. Later, after rising through the naval ranks to the Lord of the Admiralty, Sir Joseph resumed the Reigate seat from 1818 until his death at sea in 1831. Back to 1791, and the customary presentation made jointly to the library by John Somers Cox and Joseph Sidney York was the magnificent enlarged and updated edition of Chambers' Cyclopedia in 4 volumes, and 1 volume is on the display tonight. On the elevation to the peerage of John Somers Cox in 1806, his eldest son, Edward Charles, took the seat. He was another absent MP. For him, Parliament took second place to a brilliant military career, full of promise, but cut short by his death at the Siege of Burgos in 1812. Another John Somers Cox took the seat, occupied by his heroic elder brother. In 1818, he moved across and stood for Hereford in the family interest, close to the family seat at Castleditch near Ledbury, soon to be torn down and remade as the fantasy that is Eastnor Castle, worthy of his father's newly created earldom. He was replaced at Reigate by his younger brother James, and jointly they gave a collection of works, theological and philosophical, to the library in February 1819. William Magee's Discourses and Dissertations, and William Paley's collected works. The disruption in 1784 of the unbroken procession of Coxes and Yorks was also the start of more uncertain times for the two families. I will now introduce you to William Bryant Jr., who never sat in or even stood for Parliament, for Reigate or anywhere else, but whose influence was felt from then on, as he turned from a servant of the two families and a supporter of the electoral status quo into a vengeful thorn in their side. Bryant was a prolific donor of books to the library between 1786 and 1810. My theory is that this was part of his psychological warfare. William Bryant Jr., attorney, was the son of the bailiff of the manor of Reigate, also William, and sometime election agent to the Earl of Hardwicke. In 1786, on the rumour of a contested election between the previously peaceable Somers and Hardwicke factions, he compiled a survey of properties in the borough with a view to determining the voting rights and their distribution for the benefit of Lord Hardwicke. Bryant's survey, as it is known, though an invaluable resource for future historians, caused strife at the time, as the new Lord Somers took grave exception and wrote to his freeholders instructing them not to comply. The result, to the detriment of Bryant, was that the two families reassessed the electoral risks and potential costs of falling out, and after all renewed their pact. Lord Somers removed Bryant's father from his post as bailiff. They went to law, and after that Bryant Jr. nursed an undying enmity towards the Somers-Cox family. Later he fell foul of the Hardwicke family as well, being dismissed as agent by the third Earl in 1799 for defalcation, misuse of trust funds. Thereafter, until the Great Reform Act of 1832, he harried and threatened the two families that between them had the borough sewn up, by hinting that he might challenge the franchise resting with burgage freeholders only and not the freeholders at large, as his historical research had found no evidence to support it. Bryant was an antiquarian, researching but never writing a history of Reigate, and there is evidence that he planned a biography of the first and most renowned Baron Somers. Bryant gave 16 works to the library, including works of local topography, in which the collection was never strong until then, titles relating to the first Baron Somers, and Stockdale's 1784 edition of Shakespeare's plays, the first appearance of the Bard in the library. I wonder if Bryant, seeing the magnificence of the volumes given by members and gratefully received, decided that the library would become a battleground in his feud with Reigate's political grandees. In April 1803, he gave the library 3 books, 2 of them quite recently published and luxuriously bound. The other an older book, embellished with additions of his own, with coded attacks on the York faction, particularly in their elaborate inscriptions. This is the prime example. Philip's second Earl of Hardwicke, who died in 1790, was an instigator and contributor to Athenian Letters, a pastiche commentary in letter form on Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian Wars. It was devised by Philip York and his brother Charles, both later Reigate MPs, and their circle of friends, while still at Cambridge, and privately printed in the 1740s. Not published until the 1780s, when it gained popularity. Bryant's gift of the latest edition has a carefully handwritten inscription with a message for Reigate. This book is presented to the Public Library of Reigate by William Bryant as the work of a nobleman who patronised him in the early period of life and afterwards honoured him with his confidence. He deposits this book not only as a testimony of gratitude, but as an acknowledgement that the second Earl of Hardwicke inherited and added to the virtues of the great Lord Chancellor, his father, and became the most illustrious example of that family in the exercise and display of those public virtues and that private integrity, that exemption from personal prejudice, and the possession of those amiable qualities that peculiarly distinguish the real patriot from him who becomes conspicuous only by casual connection or by sacrificing the unsullied reputation of a noble family to the acquisition of temporary honours and expiring titles. The short version: I am here to praise the first two Earls of Hardwicke, but not the one who gave me the sack. And just look at the opulence of this volume. Not so much the Battle of the Books as the Battle of the Bindings. Although I have to say that end paper does look rather like something you'd find in a Petri dish. As well as this, he gave Silas Taylor's History and Antiquities of Harwich and Dovercourt, Essex, with a grandiloquent inscription in praise of Humphrey Parsons, MP for Harwich, and then the City of London. He was the younger son of Sir John Parsons, and though he stood for election in 1722 against the Jekyll-Cox interest, he hedged his bet at Harwich in the same year and found it an easier seat to win. Parsons died in 1741, and Bryant added to the book an engraving of an elaborate monument to him to go with an expression of lavish regret at what Reigate missed by passing him over. The third gift, luxuriously bound as a companion to Athenian letters, is John Watson, Memoirs of the Ancient Earls of Warren and Surrey. This too has an elaborate inscription in praise of Charles Howard, Earl of Surrey, then 11th Duke of Norfolk. If anyone has an idea to offer why praising Howard is a blow struck against the York enemy, do please let me know. The donation of these three books, though, was obviously a deliberate manoeuvre in his war with the Coxes and Yorks. In the run-up to the 1830s and the advent of parliamentary reform, Bryant was behind invitations to radicals and advocates for reform to speak and canvass in Reigate. He constantly sowed doubt and dissension between the Somers and Hardwicke factions unsuccessfully, threatening to organise a contest which never materialised. The patrons probably had a good idea that it would not, but they still had to take precautions and nurture their elections with even more care. Bryant's finances were in disarray, and he had been declared bankrupt in 1810, but there was the risk that he would find a backer with the very deep pockets needed to outspend and outtreat them. As the prospect of reform drew nearer, the care taken to nurse Reigate and the general respectability and good conduct of the members paid off, as Reigate was spared the fate of neighbouring Gatton and Bletchingley, when all three were scheduled for abolition as parliamentary boroughs. Reigate had to fight to retain its position, with 2 seats reduced to 1, and all the qualifying properties in Reigate Foreign added to the constituency. That brought the size of the electorate up just enough to squeak through as one of the smallest remaining boroughs. While the fate of the seat was debated, friends were found in unexpected places. London Radical MP Robert Waithman stated in the Commons in 1831 that he had to admit that for the previous century, the members for Reigate had exercised their influence to the satisfaction of the inhabitants. It was noted they were expected to contribute handsomely to local objects. I suppose that might have been anything from lashings of beer at election time to the gift of books to the public library. However, John Somers Cox the younger, by then Viscount Eastnor, might have been pitching it a bit strong when he said in the Commons, in response to a local petition for reform, that Reigate had been perfectly free from corruption of any kind for the last 50 years. That is apart from the small matter of buying up the franchise for all that time and longer. In the event then, Reigate survived as a parliamentary seat. Lord Hardwicke left the field, Lord Somers bought out his interest, and his heir, that same Viscount Eastnor, was again returned unopposed in the first reformed election. Plus ça change. The final gift from an MP did not arrive until 1847, when Thomas Somers Cox gave a 3-volume set of Cardinal Manning's sermons. In 1857, the Somers family finally gave up their interest in the seat, and in the words of Wilfrid Hooper, Reigate's historian, Reigate became a happy hunting ground for candidates with money to spare and a thirst for influence. The contested elections became a byword for corruption, bribery and treating that would have made any respectable Cox or York die of shame. In 1865, when the election was won by Grenville, Luce and Gore, there was a petition and a commission of inquiry was set up into the conduct of that and every election since 1857. The evidence of bribery and corruption was overwhelming. In the 1687 Representation of the People Act, the Reigate seat was abolished and the electorate absorbed into the Mid-Surrey division, and over 400 electors found guilty of bribery or receiving bribes were disenfranchised. Reigate was one of the rottenest of boroughs, held up with neighbours Gatton and Bletchingley as a living example of the need for reform. However, the orderly conduct of its business and the more or less conscientious attention of its members to good government and the interests of its inhabitants saved it from oblivion in 1832. The traces left by this parliamentary history on the library and its collection are to be highly valued as evidence that despite the neglect of the likes of the Reverend Mr. Stead, Andrew Cranston's public library as a legacy to Reigate was deeply respected throughout the 18th century and beyond. You'll see that the word royal has somehow attached itself to it in this 1820s topographical watercolour. Nobody knows why, but it's a mark of respect. The books presented by members of Parliament were generously and carefully chosen, and from the evidence of their condition and the need for conservation over the years, highly appreciated and well used. Whatever one's views about the subversion of democracy, some grudging respect may be due to the most famous Lord Somers. He shaped the Reigate constituency for well over a century and set the tone for his public-minded heirs and successors, who mostly conducted their political lives with integrity to the standards of the day. Some stellar examples of their benefactions to the library are on display, and I hope that you will enjoy looking at them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hilary. Wasn't that fascinating, ladies and gentlemen? The nepotism is quite breathtaking, isn't it? But we have landed up with some excellent additions to the library. For us here, that's a very definite plus. So thank you very much for taking us through that. We now have the interval, as I mentioned earlier, and there are refreshments at the back on my left. And so please go and have some refreshments there. The exhibition in the chancel will be stewarded, and so it'll be possible for you to go and see those books there if you wish, although I'd repeat what I said earlier about no food or drink there, so have your food and drink first before going, or vice versa. We're ready to reconvene, what should we say, roughly, Hilary? About 8:45, about 20 minutes or thereabouts. What I may do is give a sort of warning order about 3 or 4 minutes beforehand, just to wake you up if you're doing anything else. But we'll say approximately 20 minutes, okay? And we'll see how it goes. Thank you very much. And then we'll reconvene. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we'll probably want to start in about 5 minutes or thereabouts. So if you'd bear that in mind and return to your seats, not immediately, but within the next 4 to 5 minutes, please, and then we'll restart. Thank you very much. Right. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We're now about to start our second lecture. Our second speaker is Dr. Andrea Thomas, who will talk on the subject of the Ogilvy Atlases and Appeal. And those atlases you will have seen are in the exhibition there. They're actually there, so you have had an opportunity to see them, or you may afterwards have another opportunity to actually set eyes on them. Many of you will know the name of John Ogilvy. It is important in the world of cartography. Andrea has been a trustee of the Cranston Library since 2003. That is 20 years for all you mathematicians, and is a notable scholar and author of historical books. Those of you who were at last year's lecture will remember her tour de force then, and so I'm delighted to invite Andrea to address us again. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Aha, good. That's what I was waiting for.
Microphone.
Yep. There we go. Right, good evening, everyone. It's lovely to see so many people here tonight to support the Cranston Library, and I'd like to say a special hello to those watching online. Can you all hear me now? Yes. Yes, good, excellent. So, as the title of my talk tonight indicates, I will be making a special appeal for help in restoring two of our most remarkable books. But before I get into the nitty-gritty of that project, I'd like to tell you a story. And I would like to thank my fellow trustee, Sean Hawkins, who very kindly gave me many of the details of this tale from his own research. Once upon a time, sometime towards the end of the 17th century, we don't have an exact date, I'm afraid, a little girl was born, called Elizabeth Holford. Sadly, we have no portrait either. We know very little about her parents, Henry and Mary, but crucially, she became a substantial heiress. In 1709, her mother's uncle bequeathed to her the estate and manor of Bermondsey, now in South London, and then he obligingly died the following year. So in 1710, Elizabeth Holford became a wealthy landowner in her own right, and thus a very desirable marriage prospect. You can just imagine the suitors circling like bees round a honeypot. Elizabeth Holford's mother had many Reigate connections, and the successful suitor was a Reigate gentleman and sometime MP for the borough, Edward Thurland, Esquire. And Hilary did mention him in her talk. Elizabeth and Edward married in 1711 and had no surviving children. They lived in the mansion house known as Great Doods, which once stood in the area of the modern Eversfield Road and Deerings Road. These pictures, here's the first one, I'll show you the second one in a tick. These pictures show a later house on the same site, which was sold for development in 1906. So there's the mansion house, and there's a plan of the estate from the details of the sale. Immediately after the marriage, presumably by the wishes of her new husband, Elizabeth's lands in Bermondsey were put up for sale. The bill of sale has not survived, but we may well imagine that Edward Thurland received a substantial cash bonanza from the sale of his wife's lands, which was certainly accomplished by 1718 and probably somewhat earlier than that. Now, if you will allow me, I would just like to say a little bit about the legal status of married women in this period. Under the law of the land, a wife was entirely subject to her husband, and all her property and possessions belonged to him. Husband and wife were regarded as one legal entity, and a wife could not act in her own right. For example, she needed her husband's agreement to make a will. It was possible to give a wife a legal personality of her own and to ring-fence lands and property for her own use, but only if legal documents were drawn up to that effect before a marriage or an inheritance took place, and this seldom happened. Not until the Married Women's Property Act of 1882 were wives given even a little bit of legal protection from the powers of their husbands, and much more followed in the 20th century, of course. Another point to note is that property usually descended in the male line, and that women only inherited lands in the absence of male heirs, generally speaking. A marriage that produced no sons was usually regarded as deficient, and the wife generally got the blame. Unmarried women and widows did have their own legal personalities, but often found themselves short of income and therefore dependent on the charity of wealthier male relatives. Those of you familiar with the life and work of Jane Austen, who lived a century later than Elizabeth Holford, will be well aware of this, I'm sure. We have very little documentary evidence of the life of Elizabeth Holford, later Thurland. But as far as we can tell, she seems to have had some issues with her legal status. Not only were her lands sold for the benefit of her husband immediately after their marriage, but also he left her shockingly little in his will. Edward Thurland died in December 1731, and Elizabeth lived on for another 8 years until 1739. In his will, he left all his money and property to his 3 nieces. Only towards the end of the will, almost as an afterthought, does he grant to his dear wife, quote, the moderate use of all the household goods which she brought with her during her life, unquote, provided that she continues to live in his house. And that's it. So under this arrangement, after her death, Elizabeth's household goods would revert to the possession of Edward's nieces, who in any case would be the owners of the house in which she lived as a widow. So Edward Thurland was graciously giving back to his wife the use of a small portion of the property that she had given to him. Nevertheless, somehow, at the time of her death, the widowed Elizabeth clearly had some money and possessions, but no lands, to bestow where she wished. In her will, she left her wealth to be divided equally between 2 female cousins, one of whom was married. And Elizabeth's will makes it quite clear that the married cousin should receive her inheritance, quote, to her own proper use and benefit, as if she were sole or unmarried, without the intermeddling control or contradiction of her husband. Elizabeth Holford Thurland was clearly a woman of some character, who sought to protect a younger relative from the problems that she had experienced. I feel I would have liked to have met her. And there is a sense in which we can meet Elizabeth, at least indirectly. In December 1713, 2 years into her marriage, Elizabeth Thurland, noted as wife of Edward, gave 2 books to the Cranston Library. The gift was recorded in her own name, and so is likely to have come from amongst her own possessions that she brought with her 2 great dudes. We may also imagine that Edward gave his permission and approved of her donation, since he had previously donated 27 of his own books to the library at the time of the foundation in 1701, as Hilary noted earlier. Another reason to surmise that the books originated in Elizabeth's own family is that they both contain ownership marks, which you can see here. The initials C-A-H, one of which has been partially defaced. Although we do not know who C.A. was, the H is very likely to indicate a Holford. Each book also contains a number, which looks as if it might be contemporary with the initials. Can't be certain. 87 and 89, as you can see. I would dearly like to know what volume 88 was. Both of these remarkable books may be viewed in the Chancellor exhibition this evening. I hope you've had a chance to have a look at them. The 2 books given by Elizabeth Thurland are among the largest and most fascinating in the library's collection. They are 2 volumes from a larger set of 5 atlases, collectively known as the English Atlas. The volumes cover China, Japan, Africa, Asia, and America, and were published between 1669 and 1673 by John Ogilby, Royal Cosmographer to King Charles II. The Cranston volumes are Africa, published in 1670, and America of 1671. So they were already more than 40 years old when Elizabeth Thurland gave them to the library. John Ogilby was a remarkable, multi-talented buccaneer of a man who, in a long life from 1600 to 1676, worked as a dancer and dancing master, a soldier, a ship's captain briefly, the founder of 2 theatres, an impresario, composer, translator, printer, publisher, and cartographer. He was originally from Scotland, possibly an illegitimate son of an aristocratic house, and he was formerly apprenticed to a London dancing master as a boy. But in all the other accomplishments, he was largely self-taught. He held the honorific, royally bestowed titles of Master of the Revels for Ireland, that's entertainments, Master of the Royal Imprimery, that is the King's printer, and, as we have seen, Royal Cosmographer, and that really meant geographer rather than astronomer. He seemed to have a knack for cultivating good relations with rich and influential people, and he married a wealthy heiress. But, like the Thurlands, they had no children. It should be noted that at his death, in contrast to Edward Thurland, John Ogilby left his entire extensive estate to his wife, jointly with her grandson from a previous marriage. Among his publications were his own translations of the works of Virgil and Homer, and an extended version of Aesop's Fables, in which he wrote some new fables of his own to add to the traditional ones. Sort of thing John Ogilby did. As something of a mover and a shaker in the City of London, he played a significant part in devising the coronation procession of King Charles II in 1661. The Great Fire of London of 1666 destroyed, amongst many other things, his house, printworks, and entire stock of books. But he swiftly recovered his status and fortune by becoming one of just 4 men appointed to survey and map out the City of London in preparation for the rebuilding work after the fire. This huge undertaking seems to have spurred his interest and expertise in map making when he was already in his 60s. And here is one of the superb maps he produced at the time, with the assistance of William Morgan, his wife's grandson. As well as his maps of London and the 5 volumes of the English Atlas, he also produced the most detailed survey and road atlas of Great Britain at the time, for which he is probably most famous. It was entitled Britannia and published in 1675, the year before he died. His cartographical work is still much admired today, and for good reason, as you can see. John Ogilby produced his maps of London and Great Britain by surveying the ground in person, with many assistants, of course. But he never travelled to Africa, America, or Asia. So for his volumes on these territories, he turned to the foremost European cartographers of his age, principally Dutch scholars. He freely and shamelessly took the works of these authors, translated them into English, and reprinted their maps, sometimes without even changing the Dutch headings and titles. The 5 volumes of the English Atlas are thus a skillful rehash of existing European geographical knowledge presented for a British audience. Despite their immense size, the volumes were popular and hugely successful. Although they were called atlases, they contain so much more than one would expect in the modern understanding of the word. They include many maps, of course, but there are also beautiful topographical, zoological, and ethnographical engravings and extensive descriptions of the countries, peoples, and customs of the respective lands. Ogilby was clearly tapping into a thirst for knowledge about the wider world in an age of European exploration, expansion, and empire building. His volumes also take it for granted that far-flung territories and peoples were ripe for exploitation, and that European traders and settlers had a God-given right to help themselves to the wealth of these lands for their own benefit. And in that attitude, he was very much of his age. The volume on Africa describes all the North African states from Egypt to the Straits of Gibraltar, and then travels down the Atlantic coast around the Gulf of Guinea and down to the Cape of Good Hope, then up the east coast, taking in Madagascar and ending in the Red Sea. Here is the title page listing all the exciting things contained in the book, such as descriptions of coasts, harbours, creeks, rivers, lakes, cities, towns, castles and villages, their customs, modes, manners, languages, religions, and inexhaustible treasure, note, with their governments and policy, variety of trade and barter, and also their wonderful plants, beasts, birds, and serpents. So it's quite a list. And here is the frontispiece. I think perhaps you may have seen this in the exhibition, showing an allegorical figure of Africa in the middle, surrounded by examples of the different types of people and animals on the continent, with even some pyramids in the background. I think you can just see them in the top right-hand corner there. This is the map of the whole continent. showing much more detail, as you can see, of the coast than of the largely unexplored inland regions, then unexplored. And there are many other maps showing smaller sections of the territories in close-up. And here are some examples of the other beautiful engravings in the volume. A view of the Moroccan city of Saleh, which is apparently near Rabat. A rather fanciful depiction of a procession by the King of Benin, in the region of modern-day Benin and Nigeria. And an attempt to portray some animals, an eagle and a hyena, perfectly recognisable, and what I think is intended to be a crocodile, but that one's a bit dodgy. The volume on America follows a similar format. It describes all the lands known to the Europeans of the day, from Canada, south through what would later become the USA, through Central America, the Caribbean islands, and into South America, right down to the tip at Tierra del Fuego, which Ogilby calls Magellanica. The title page, again, offers an extensive list of the goodies inside, much like Africa. Whilst the frontispiece shows an allegorical figure of America, female this time, scattering riches from a cornucopia. And the map of the whole continent indicates the extent of European exploration at this point. The Portuguese and Spanish empires of Central and South America are recorded in impressive detail. But Ogilby and his Dutch sources have no inkling of the extent of the Great Lakes and the Great Plains, and no knowledge at all of the Northwest Passage, Alaska, the Bering Strait, or even the Rocky Mountains. Only the southern part of California is shown, which makes it look rather like an island. However, Ogilby was very careful to label the settlement that the Dutch called New Amsterdam as New York, a forced transfer that had taken place in only 1664, so for him very recent. Here is a view of Havana on Cuba, with some wonderful details of ship's rigging there. Here is a European idea of the worship of pagan idols by the Native American tribes. Again, like the King of Benin's procession, really rather fanciful and imaginative. And here are some delightful llamas from the Andes. I just love this picture, it's one of my favourites. So, as you can see, these are fascinating volumes, giving the reader an armchair tour of distant and exotic lands, peoples, and animals. As such, we think the Ogilby volumes were often read in the library itself, and were also borrowed by a range of local readers, even though the practical difficulties of getting them from the library to the home and back again were considerable. I always imagine a couple of burly servants with a wheelbarrow being in attendance. Of the two books, America was by far the more popular with borrowers. Africa is recorded in the borrower's register only twice, taken out by Mr. Benjamin Thornton in 1725, and by Mrs. Gardam in 1829, so a century's gap. On the other hand, America was borrowed by 9 different readers in total. Mr. Benjamin Thornton again in 1725, a few months before he took out Africa. A clergyman in 1782, a glazier in 1783, and then by 6 different readers in quick succession between 1825 and 1830, one of whom was Mrs. Gardam again. Ogleby seems to have been very fashionable in those 5 years. I wonder why. I have no idea. Some of the borrowers are identified as tradesmen of the town, such as a harness maker and a hatter, as well as the glazier already mentioned. I think it is very likely that once the books were in the home of a Reigate reader, they would have been perused by many more people than just the named borrower. And one can imagine that the volumes would have been an object of curiosity, wonder, and animated discussion. They are certainly very popular with visitors to the library today. And that brings me to the reason for this special appeal. As many of you will be aware, the library has had a rolling programme of repair and conservation work on our books running for many years. Indeed, you can see some of the most recently conserved books in the exhibition tonight. To a considerable extent, this conservation programme was underpinned by an annual grant from Surrey County Council, for which we were very grateful, and which used to pay for our specialist insurance premiums. This allowed us to devote all other donations to conservation work. In these straitened times, the Surrey County Council grant was first frozen and then gradually tapered down to 0, so that we now receive no money from that source. We still have sufficient funds available to pay for our insurance premiums over the next few years, and our governing document obliges the trustees to purchase insurance for the library, quite rightly too. But our ability to fund repair and conservation work has inevitably been rather constrained as a result. Over the last 20 years, we have conserved nearly 150 of our most dilapidated books at a total cost of nearly £35,000. We have spent an average of about £230 per volume and been lucky enough to find individual sponsors for some of our more expensive projects, with the rest of the money raised from the contributions of you, our wonderfully generous supporters. At the time we drew up our list of priority books for repair in 2004, the Ogleby atlases were judged to be in pretty good condition, certainly in comparison with some of the other volumes on the list, and so they didn't make it onto the list. There was, of course, some wear and tear to the bindings, which inevitably comes with use over time, but in the last 20 years, their condition has sadly deteriorated. The main problem is their sheer size and weight. As they have been sitting quietly on our shelves, the great mass of the 2 text blocks, that is actually the pages of the books, have started to sag under their own weight. And this has put strain on the integrity of the bindings, the spines, and the structure of the boards, so that they are now in need of some expert intervention to repair the worst damage and to stabilise their condition to prevent further problems in the future. Many of you know our expert conservators, Nick and Charlotte Cowlishaw, who have worked tirelessly for the library over many years, and they have advised that each volume is in need of the following work. First and foremost, the construction of made-to-measure book shoes to support the weight of the text blocks and relieve the strain of the sagging pages. And here is an example of just such a shoe made for a different, smaller book in the collection. And if you look carefully, you can see that there's a platform, a little platform at the bottom of the shoe, which supports the text block and relieves any strain on the spines and boards. So it's keeping it raised off the ground, as it were, off the shelf. Secondly, the Ogleby volumes need repairs to the bottom edges and corners of the boards, which, as you can see, have started to buckle under the weight of the sagging text blocks. You can see on the pictures behind me, some of the boards are looking a bit sort of crushed at the bottom, and one of the corners there, these photos are both from Africa, actually, which is the worst of the two volumes. The corner there has got so bent that there's a bit of the leather has come off. And also to the, hang on, there's another corner, that one's America. And you can see the damage there. And also to the spines, which you can see in these pictures are starting to pull away from the shifting boards, because the whole thing is gradually in movement. And thirdly, we need to make repairs to the stitching and end caps of the binding, and repairs to the end paper joints, and also to some of the pages. But these photos show you the joints. There's Africa on the left and America on the right. All of this work is estimated to cost about £1,500 per volume. So we need to raise a total of £3,000 to fund the work. We normally expect to see total donations from each lecture of about £1,000 a year. So as you can see, we have set ourselves an ambitious target for fundraising in 2023-24. I know that these are difficult times, and we're all experiencing problems with the cost of living, so I'm a little bit reluctant to ask you to be even more generous than usual. But I hope you will agree that the restoration and stabilisation of the Ogleby atlases is a worthy cause, and I hope you will be able to offer us donations a little bit bigger than normal, if at all possible. And if anyone feels willing and able to offer larger sums of sponsorship for part, or even, dare I say, all of the Ogleby project, we would love to hear from you. We always include book plates acknowledging sponsors in the relevant volumes, so in that way our sponsors themselves become part of the history of the library. As you can see, Hilary has produced some striking red flyers explaining the Ogleby appeal. So please do take some and pass them on to your friends, family and wider connections, basically to anyone you think might be interested in helping us. And please do use the gift aid envelopes if you are eligible, because this allows us to reclaim money from the taxman. Rest assured that we are still in the position at the moment to devote all the money raised tonight to the repair and conservation of our books. Thank you all for coming tonight to support the library and our 2023 appeal. We are very grateful for all your donations, large and small, and for your interest in our remarkable library. A special thank you to those who have already donated this year, and if you are about to, please give generously. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Andrea. John Ogleby was a very eclectic individual, wasn't he? With multiple skills, including, so we've learnt tonight, plagiarism. But the two wonderful volumes there, you now know all about them, and if you want to see them closer afterwards, you may do so. They're in the exhibition there in the chancel. Thank you again very much, Andrea, for that. And indeed, following on that, I have a very pleasant little duty to perform. I've got two little gifts, and I've got to make sure I get them the right way round. So I'd like to give that. This one has Andrea on it, so if I may.
That's me.
And this one, believe it or not, has Hilary on it, so I will. That was a very pleasant duty for me to perform. The library will be open, I think that's right, isn't it, for a while, for those who'd like to have a little look, particularly those perhaps who haven't been up there before. You'll find it fascinating. I'd just like finally to thank a number of people who have contributed to this evening, apart from our speakers, of course. There are the stewards, thank you very much. There are those who catered for us, thank you very much for doing that. And the technology, which has worked very well, thank you very much for making sure that our technology, sound and vision, has worked as it should do. So with that, I'd like to wish everybody good night, and please have a safe journey home. Thank you very much all for coming. Right.